You're listening to episode 226 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. David Loy joins us again to speak about his new book, A New Buddhist Path: Enlightenment, Evolution, and Ethics in the Modern World. Hi, everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment: Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. What does the term ethics mean to you? What does the term mean when you combine it with Buddhism? What does an ethical Buddhist do and say, and even perhaps think? One of the most active areas of discussion in contemporary Buddhism and the mindfulness movement is just that. What's going on with ethics? We see what have been considered enlightened, if I may use that word here, teachers in the Sangha taking advantage of their students' naive understanding, their own powerful positions, and inflict tremendous suffering on those around them. We also see practitioners within these same traditions suggesting that mindfulness programs, all lumped together as just one cohesive unit, are missing those same ethics which seem to have failed to curb the appetites and salacious activities of some traditional teachers. So, what's a contemporary Buddhist to do? David Robert Loy is a professor, writer, and Zen teacher in the Sambo Kyodan tradition of Japanese Zen Buddhism. He's a prolific author, and his books include The World is Made of Stories, Awareness Bound and Unbound, Buddhist Essays, and the very popular Money, Sex, War, Karma, Notes for a Buddhist Revolution. His articles appear regularly in the pages of major journals such as Tikkun and Buddhist magazines including Tricycle, Turning Wheel, Shambhala-san, and Buddha Dharma, as well as in a variety of scholarly journals. He is on the editorial or advisory boards of the journals Cultural Dynamics, World Views, Contemporary Buddhism, Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and World Fellowship of Buddhist Review. He is also on the advisory boards of Buddhist Global Relief, the Clear View Project, and the Ernst Becker Foundation. David lectures nationally and internationally on various topics, focusing primarily on the encounter between Buddhism and modernity, what each can learn from the other. He is especially concerned about social and ecological issues. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Earl Grey. Our guest today returning to us is our friend David Loy. David, nice to speak with you again. Welcome back.
Thank you, Ted. Nice to be chatting with you again.
This is our third time having a conversation, and when last we left our intrepid adventurer, it was with our friend Ron Purser, and there was some very insightful and good dialogue around Buddhist concerns around the mindfulness movement. And that was a bit over a year ago, and I'm wondering if you'd care to update us on what you've been doing since then.
Well, not so much on the mindfulness front. I mean, Ron knows just so much more about both what's going on in that world and in particular in the corporate world. So I've really left that to him. My focus has continued to be more generally on Buddhism and various issues around social engagement, especially eco-dharma. For a couple of years, there was some frustration that there didn't seem to be all that much interest in really going into that. In other words, there were a number of workshops or retreats focusing on eco-dharma that were either canceled or should have been canceled because so few people signed up. But just in the last year or two, things have really picked up, and I'm finding that very gratifying. So just more and more interest, not only in eco-dharma, but in the whole question of the relationship between the Dharma and the kind of social and ecological challenges that we're facing today. And that applies both in terms of my sort of teaching activities, running around doing this and that, but also it really applies to the book as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that there are so many different ways in which the Dharma can manifest in the world. And we all have areas that we really incline towards. And for you and I, as a biology kind of person, the idea of ecological effects and our place in the world, not as owners of the world, but as partners in it with all of their life. It's just such an interesting thing that for others it's going to be more on the political spectrum, and for others something else again. And none of those are really wrong. These are all very valid manifestations.
Well, can I disagree a little bit, just to make it interesting? I mean, I think it's becoming more and more apparent that the ecological crisis is the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced, and therefore, I don't think it's going to be a matter of simply whether or not we want to deal with it. We're getting more and more in the situation where we have to deal with it, and we all have to come to terms with it one way or another. And for Buddhist practitioners, of course, there's the big issue: what do Buddhist teachings imply, if anything, about how we understand and respond to that crisis? So I just anticipate more and more focus in that direction.
I hope you're right, because of course it's one of my own personal passions. So let's talk a bit about the new book, and the titling of it for me is very interesting. And I'll want to ask first, what prompted you to write it?
Well, let me go back to the title again, if I can, because in particular, the main title, A New Buddhist Path, I have to say I'm not quite satisfied with what really seems a little bit of a pretentious title. The publishers, Wisdom and I, we had a bit of a struggle here, sort of finding the best title. And in the end, that's what we came up with. But it really does seem rather presumptuous. It's not really so much a new Buddhist path as, to some degree, a new understanding of the path. And the title that I'd now prefer, again, I don't know if others find it or if Wisdom publications themselves would be satisfied with it, but I'd prefer to say something like A New Buddhist Story. But maybe that's not so provocative a title. I don't know.
See, to me, that's much more interesting, because I'd want to hear that story.
Yeah. Getting back to your question, all of my books are in one way part of this really interesting conversation, I think, between Buddhism and modernity, and really not just conflating one to the other, not just saying that it's sufficient to sort of import Buddhism in any of its sort of Asian forms, nor just to kind of reduce it to sort of contemporary Western secular understanding. But I'm really interested in how both modernity and Buddhism can sort of question each other. That's what I really find fascinating. And so the book is, well, it's in three parts. Maybe I can just say a little bit about those. The first part, it really sort of takes a look at what do we understand by enlightenment or awakening, what's going on there. Part of my concern the last couple of years has been trying to figure out why it is that Buddhists have not been more engaged, especially in ecological issues. And I was trying to understand if there was anything within Buddhist teachings themselves that sort of inclined us that way. And basically what I came up with is that Buddhism, like a lot of other spiritual or religious traditions that developed around the same time, has to some degree a kind of cosmological dualism and individual salvation built into it, which I think does tend to divert us from this world. In other words, the traditions that developed in the axial age around the time of the Buddha, they do tend to have a stronger sense of transcendence. And to that extent, they often sort of fall into the trap of devaluing this world in relation to some other world that we want to attain. I mean, obviously, in something like the Abrahamic, the idea is that we want to qualify for an eternity in heaven with God after we die.
Go somewhere else.
Exactly. And of course, Buddhism too, well, it's a lot more complicated, but certainly in the Pali Canon, there's a lot of support for the idea that this realm of samsara, the world of not only suffering, but delusion and craving, is inherently defective. And rather than trying to improve it in some way, the idea is to sort of check out of here and transcend it.
Right. And that's something that I've always found a bit challenging by the Theravada practice is in Zen, as you well know, we have a bit of an appreciation for the uniqueness of the moment, that there's a richness there. And, that can also slip into attachment to that rather than experiencing and being present with that. With the Theravada, it just seems very toned with an aversion to this life, that samsara is something to escape, to end. And maybe that's something that the secular aspect can, and this is one of the things I really want to get into, is that contributing to one another, that might be something that can bring in some care for this world.
Exactly. I think it's also quite fascinating within the Buddhist tradition that we do have these more this worldly understandings of what's going on. I mean, you think of Nagarjuna, right? Samsara ultimately is not other than nirvana. There's sort of, the implication seems to be that they're simply different ways of experiencing this world. And transcendence isn't about trying to go somewhere else, but simply transcending maybe our usual delusive understandings of who we are and what the world is and our relationship. So that's part of what's going on in the first part of the book. And then I also turn to what I think has been a Western or modern response to that, because of course in the modern world, many of us don't see reasons to believe in that kind of transcendent dimension that's separate from this world. And I think the emphasis has often therefore been on a kind of psychologization, understanding all my problems as due to the way my mind works. And if I just understand that and sort of deal with my confused and afflictive emotions, then everything will be okay, and that's what the path is all about. I guess I'm really struck by how both of those two understandings of awakening, how in a way that they're both sort of polar opposites, right? And yet they both fall into the same indifference to the social, political, economic, and ecological world. I mean,
yeah. They're both self-centered.
Yes. Either you're escaping this world, in which case you don't have to worry about it, or all my problems are because I'm not really harmonizing with this world, and the solution is simply deal with my own mind. And in both cases, I think they tend to distract us from what's going on right here and now.
Right. And I think that second aspect that you were talking about, that to me is a watering down of the Dharma. That to me is just reducing this to a pop psychology.
I think so too. And I think that also gives us a lot of insight into, in particular, why the psychologization also doesn't really engage with the ecological crisis. For example, I think we Buddhists have our own way of resolving the problem. When we think about the ecological situation, we get anxious. And as practitioners, we know what to do when we get anxious. We sit down, we face the wall, we meditate, and our anxiety goes away. It's not really a satisfactory solution, but I think in a way the tradition or our understanding of the tradition sort of encourages that rather than actually getting up off our cushions and sort of getting out there and trying to do something about it.
Engaging, yeah. And I think that's where this tie comes in that is so fascinating to me, that your third big word in there is ethics. And that this is where, to me, I'm seeing that wonderful opportunity of us in relationship with each other, with the world, with this present moment experience right before us. And that there may be the opportunity here with that particular exploration to reinvigorate what seems to be going a little off the rails.
Well, let me mention that, what's going on in that part of the book. But first, let me finish part one here, because I think it's quite relevant that in contrast to either an understanding of awakening that involves transcending this world or simply psychologizing and sort of fitting into it better, I think we really need to get more explicit about understanding the path as I put it, deconstructing and reconstructing the sense of self, or more precisely, the relationship between my sense of self and the world that I'm a part of. And I guess what seems really powerful to me is that if that's what we understand the path as, if we understand our dukkha as suffering, as due to sort of a problematic sense of self, then I think we can also see how this fits in very well with an understanding of society as well as something that needs to be reconstructed. I mean, they go together, because we start to see that all the suffering isn't simply because of what's going on in my head. It has a lot to do with social, political, economic, and ecological events as well.
Right. Yeah. The ox herding pictures don't end with the blank picture. There's rediscovery and reintegration in the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
So tell us about the next part of the book after part one.
Well, part two is about evolution. And to me, this was in many ways the most fascinating part, because for some years now I've been quite interested in what's sometimes called the new story or the new cosmology of people like Thomas Berry and Brian Swim. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with, but it's a more spiritual understanding than the usual sort of biological random mutation. And so what I basically try to do there is offer a kind of Buddhist perspective on that, because I think it fits in so well. That's a rather more complicated story. The basic idea is that what biologists themselves are now experiencing seems to me rather comparable to what happened to physics in the early part of the last century, that there's really a revolution going on there, rather than thinking of the universe or the cosmos as simply some kind of machine. Now there's a lot more emphasis on the idea of self-organization, which again fits into the idea of constructs and reconstructions. What I mean by that is, usually when we think, or when scientists think about the world, they tend to think that it's simply a machine that runs according to a basic number of sort of physical laws. And we tend to exalt physics as sort of the ultimate science. Historically, that notion made sense back in the days when God was taken for granted as the machine maker. But if you don't have a machine maker, if you have, in fact, a machine that is constantly restructuring, reorganizing itself, making more complex versions of itself, it's a really interesting question. Does it really make sense to think of that as a machine, or is it better to talk about it, to understand it with the metaphor of an organism? And if the universe is an organism, what's going on as it becomes ever more complicated and the levels of awareness, consciousness seems to become more complex, more sophisticated, and with human beings attain a kind of self-awareness. Also, what biologists seem to be getting into now is there's more and more, I think, acceptance among certain biologists that consciousness isn't something that just sort of appears miraculously once a certain level of biological complexity appears, but that there's some awareness that goes all the way down. And from a Buddhist perspective, we can ask what that means. So anyway, what's going on in that chapter, which is a little hard to summarize? It's asking, what if we don't separate, as we usually do, different types of evolution, the evolution cosmologically of the Big Bang and the formation of galaxies and matter, and then the evolution that occurs once we get to a certain level of organic complexity, that is to say, life. And then finally, when we get to a level of human complexity, that is to say, social evolution. What happens if we look at all of those as simply parts of the same continuum? And basically, without being able to summarize it in a very meaningful way, that particular part of the book is arguing that maybe this even offers us a way to understand Buddhist awakening. There's this old fascinating challenge within Buddhism. If there's no self, who becomes awakened, right? In fact, if there's no self, who or what is striving, wants to become awakened? And I wonder if it makes sense to say, well, I think it does make sense to say that in a way, the emptiness is the awakening of the earth itself, the cosmos itself. Can we look upon the cosmos as, in this complexification, sort of working to become more aware? And what I argue in there is that the fundamental stuff of the cosmos is this constant creative principle, that the universe isn't something that is evolving, but that the evolutionary process is itself. If we don't dualize between the thing and the process, I think what we can see is that there's this constant creativity, and with human beings, with our level of self-consciousness, we become epicenters of that fundamental creative process. Maybe that's what it means to say that we're made in the image of God.
It's interesting to see the evolution of scientific views that 100 years ago, biology was the study of capturing something, killing it, and taking it apart, stuffing it, putting it in a museum. And that today the shift and the true passion, the sincerity of this, and not just in the biological sciences, is an interconnectedness. And that may be part of our growing up as children of the 60s, that we did grow up and now are people who do make decisions, and we have passed that on to our children and our grandchildren, this care. And last night I was fortunate enough to be in the audience downtown in Minneapolis at the Orpheum for what turned out to be a 3-hour wonderful presentation, conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And it was amazing. At the end of it, he brought on Bill Nye the Science Guy on phone, and they joined in the conversation. And the way Neil finished the talk was to read from Carl Sagan's wonderful Pale Blue Dot. Mm-hmm. And that was something very near and dear to my heart. It's a passage that my wife put in our wedding vows about half a year ago. And we held hands during that. But that really is something which is endemic in the biological sciences, in physics. To hear Neil speak about this, to hear Carl Sagan speak about this, that passion and that depth of interest and that yearning of an experienced connection with everything, that it is all connected. And for folks who are listening to this, you've seen it before. I've posted in the past, and heads up, I'm going to do it again. I will be embedding Symphony of Science in this episode as well, because it's all about that connection. And it includes Neil and a number of other greats on this. To describe exactly what I think you're talking about, David, is that it's not just self. There is relation to other always.
Ted, are you familiar with the very short documentary film Overview? Have you seen that?
Tell me more.
Oh, it's wonderful. Basically, it's about 18 minutes, I think. It's produced by Planetary Collective, and it's basically a film about how our consciousness changed once we saw the Earth from space. And a lot of it is interviewing astronauts and what that experience, looking out the window of their shuttles, whatever, what that experience meant to them, how they were deeply transformed. So I strongly recommend it. It's available on YouTube and video. It's simply called Overview.
Wonderful. And for folks who are listening, I'll get that on this episode page, at the very least a link to it, if not embedded. Thank you, David.
No, very moving.
So, how about that third part of the book? Tell us about that.
Yes, well, basically what's going on in the third part is sort of a riff on a famous statement by Gary Snyder about 50 years ago. He published an essay on Buddhist anarchism that included a famous statement. The mercy of the West has been social revolution. The mercy of the East has been insight into the nature of the self void, or I think now we'd say something like the emptiness of the self. And then he says we need both. And basically that's a discussion of how it is that the highest ideal, and I emphasize the word ideal, but the highest ideal of the West, which is now no longer just the West. I mean, it's globalized as kind of the whole modern world. But the highest ideal of the West has been social transformation. The idea that, we can reconstruct our societies so that they're less exploitative. And although you and I and most listeners are very aware of all the ways in which we fall short, and in some ways things are getting worse now with the growing gap between rich and poor. But nonetheless, in the modern world, a lot's been achieved when you think about political revolutions, overthrowing kings and emperors, and constitutions, bills of rights, anti-slavery movements, civil rights movements, women's movement, and in our lifetimes, gay rights, etc. I mean, a lot has been achieved, but also, why not more? What's holding us back? Why, in some ways, do we sense that we're going backwards there? And the other side, though, of course, the Buddhist concern has not been social transformation. I mean, you can hardly find a word for that corresponds to social justice in Buddhism, but the focus has been personal transformation, that we can, as I said before, deconstruct and reconstruct our sense of self to end the suffering that comes from the delusion of separate self. And basically what that part is arguing is that those two ideals, or you might even call them projects, how they really need each other, how it's not been enough to think that we can simply change our institutions and everything's going to be okay, right? I mean, supposing we lived in the most perfect possible, ideal economic and social system, but if you and I are still motivated by greed, ill will, and delusion, and other people as well, is that system really going to work as well as we need it to?
And it will change over time because that is made up of us with our lobha, dosa, moha.
Exactly. And from the other side, though, I look a bit historically at Buddhism, and although Buddhism as institutions in Asia, it certainly has focused on personal transformation, I think there's some intriguing things within the life of the Buddha himself that make some scholars think that he had a broader vision, that he wasn't just trying to create a religion in our modern sense. And we have to be careful here that we don't project back onto him
our own contemporary Western ideas about that. Yeah,
exactly. Which are so enervated now, or weakened compared to what religion used to be. And in particular, if you look at the Buddha's attitude toward women and caste, I mean, there's powerful things in the Pali Canon that certainly reveal he was a lot more liberated than, frankly, the way the institution developed after him. I mean, all Asian Buddhist societies are patriarchal, for example, but my reading of the Buddha is that he wasn't. And that story where he sort of only very reluctantly accepted women, yeah, that's a very corrupted story. And I mean, I had a chance to talk to Bhikkhu Bodhi about that too. And it's we can't take that story at face value. So there's issues there. There's also issues with caste. There's wonderful stories in the canon about that. But after the Buddha died, the Sangha, in order to survive, it had to make its peace with oppressive polities, kings, and so forth. And to a fair extent, it was dependent on support, or at least toleration. And interestingly, of course, with the karma teaching, there was something that could be turned in that direction, right? So, I mean, I think that's what happened with karma, in the sense that, unlike the Buddha's attitude toward caste, what we ended up with was the idea that if someone's born a prince and is going to be a king, well, not only must he have really good karma, but he's somebody that we should obey. And if you're born poor, disadvantaged, well, you must have done something really bad in your past lifetime. And if you're born a woman, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, but if you obey yourself and do what we tell you, you can be reborn as a man.
Yeah, it's interesting that there is I think an idealization about, well, in the past, historically, Buddhism, there weren't these ties to money, to finance, and it was just, a dream of mendicant monks walking, taking alms and living in the woods, and the bears and the wolves and the tigers don't eat them, they lay at their feet, and how wonderful. And yet, if you actually read the canon, there from the very beginning has been a dependence on support. There has to be. It has to come from somewhere. And I'm fascinated by this change as a tradition where alms rounds are a very important aspect of the practice itself for monastics, that there is an interdependence there that going on takohatsu encourages. And yet we see this in the West that doesn't quite work so well. That's maybe a little more challenging because it's not what our societal structure is like. And so the ways in which support occurs might be a little less palatable to our ideal of what we think things were, when really there was always, here's a park that was given to you by a rich guy. Does that mean it's inherently bad and corrupt? I see some of those kinds of criticisms on mindfulness in discussions where there's the accusation of, it's a tool of the elite and it's not doing X, Y, Z, and it's all for political stuff to get more money. I'm like, whoa, not so. And this is created to help people with severe pain. It's meant to help people. It started in a basement. And one of the earliest programs was for prison inmates. And so to this idea that this was corrupt from the very beginning, not so. And that the tradition was exempt from having support from the elite that's said in a disparaging fashion. Like, well, it's always been part of it. We do need that support. Always have.
I agree. And well, two things. First of all, if you go back to the earliest, Buddhist teachings, it's very clear the Buddha doesn't think of money as bad. The issue is how you earn it and how you spend it. I've been very fortunate in my life. I've had two wonderful teachers, both of whom were, well, neither of them was what we would call wealthy, but they were well-to-do enough that they didn't have to worry about money. And it was because of their generosity that I was able to practice. So my goodness, I felt deeply and will always be indebted to their generosity, which was only possible because they had, some money to spare. Or in other words, they didn't have to depend on me to pay for them. And as a poor, largely penniless hippie in Hawaii, I couldn't have done it, Yeah, when I started Zen practice. Yeah. The other thing about the money side, though, at the beginning, Buddhism really was partly dependent on royal support. It didn't get down into that sort of support, say, of peasants or farmers. That took a while. And so it's not as though that accommodation was a bad thing. To some extent, I think it was necessary. What's fascinating now, of course, is now that Buddhism comes to the West, where we have a different possibilities. When you look at Asia and you have to deal with kings and emperors, and some of whom declare themselves to be bodhisattvas or Buddhas, it's a little bit tricky as far as offending the state when the state is not democratic and can do pretty much what it wants. But Buddhism, of course, true to its own emphasis on impermanence and insubstantiality, has always transformed pretty radically whenever it comes into contact with a new culture. It doesn't just impose itself. So now Buddhism faces its greatest challenge and greatest interaction ever as it comes to the West. And one of the really exciting things is, the kinds of emphasis on democracy, free speech, etc., really opens the door for the development of the kind of social and ecological critique that really enables Buddhism to extend its analysis and look at more institutionalized forms of dukkha. Rather than thinking all the dukkha is simply my own karma from past lifetimes, how my own mind is working, we can see how the three poisons, greed, ill will, and delusion, have been institutionalized in our economic system, our militarism, and the commercial media. So there's lots of new possibilities that are, I think, being developed here, and frankly, not a moment too soon, given the kind of ecological and economic crises I think we're in.
Yeah, and hopefully not too late. And I think you're absolutely right that this suffering and karma is, or volitional actions have effects in the world. That karma isn't about something that occurred several lifetimes ago and now I'm stuck with being poor or whatever. It's my volitional actions, they ripple in the world, like tossing a pebble into a pond, and we get to choose right now what is the action we're going to take, whatever it is. And that's that ripple, those effects in the world, they're not done in isolation. They cannot help but impact the immediate surroundings, if not larger surroundings. And this whole, I like the idea of, and I've always been partial to this concept of thinking of it, not it being in the classic scientific sense of an organism, but the world as an organism, thinking of it in that fashion, that there are meaningful impacts, that when we horrifically pollute one organ of the body, or we suck up all the water from another because we're looking for oil deep underground, perhaps we wouldn't be surprised when that part of the body collapses and we see bad results from that. So it's all in relationship. And I think what I'm wondering is, David, if that's part of the tie to what I'd like to talk about next is our meaning and how you mean it in the book about enlightenment. It's so core to this.
Let me just say something a little bit about karma first, if I may here, because I think so often we misunderstand that sort of revolutionary part of the Buddhist teaching, I mean, people believed in karma at the time of the Buddha, but they tended to understand it in a rather mechanistic, ritualistic way. And the Buddha's emphasis on motivation was really, really transformative. The word karma literally means action, but we get caught up on consequences, the fruit. And I think we sort of put the cart before the horse and miss the fact of what I think he's really saying, that if you want to transform the quality of your life, there's a very simple, if not always easy way to do that. Change your motivations. That if we actually change our motivations, then we will actually be experiencing the world in a different way. And the world will respond, I mean, not always, but people will understand that and they will tend to respond to us differently as well. So I think that's really huge. What ties the whole new book together, I think, is this emphasis on construction. Understanding the path is about, in the first part, talking about how, for example, in meditation, we're sort of deconstructing the self, and how karma can be understood then, as what I've just said, as that reconstruction, so that when I am no longer motivated by greed, ill will, delusion, but instead generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, then I literally become a different kind of person in a different kind of world. And then the second part of the book sort of is a more general looking at the cosmos as a self-organizing, reconstructing universe. And then the third part is how we can understand in the modern world when these great civilizations or traditions come together, the Western influence, the Western emphasis on social reconstruction, transformation, and the Asian emphasis on individual reconstruction, how something really important happens when they come together. And I think we have this really interesting archetype within the Buddhist tradition that really expresses that very well. In fact, I wonder if this is the most important thing that Buddhism has to offer now, the idea of the Bodhisattva. Because the Bodhisattva has can we say a double path or a path that has two sides, right? What I mean by that is that he or she continues to work on her own practice, right? Her own meditations, continues that personal transformation, but doesn't just sort of sit on the cushion and think that that's enough, gets up and then brings that brings that equanimity, that experience of emptiness, that non-attachment to results into actually engaging in the social, political, ecological world. And I just see how well those two things go together on both sides. I mean, if you think about it just in terms of Buddhist practice, we all come, I think, or almost all of us come to the practice because in some way we suffer. There's something about our lives that isn't working well enough. Why else would we spend all that time and money and energy facing the wall, right? But as we begin to open up, as we begin to, awaken a little bit, we realize that we're not separate from other people, that sense of separation is in a way the most problematical delusion. So if we just keep sitting facing the wall and thinking that the solution is to become more and more deeply enlightened, I think after a point that becomes part of the problem rather than the solution. I mean, the real challenge for many of us, I think, is not sort of having realizations or insights when we're meditating, but actually getting off our cushions, going out in the world and integrating those into how we actually live our lives. And certainly today, part of that challenge is the ecological. The other side of it is we're all familiar with the phenomenon of activist burnout and frustration and anger and nihilism that without some kind of personal practice that also emphasizes our own individual transformation, without some kind of grounding that gives us some non-attachment to the specific things we're working on, it's very hard to sustain the kind of action in the world that's necessary. So I just think it's really exciting that we're in a situation where we can see the importance of both. And it seems to me there's a sense in which right now we're all being called to become bodhisattvas or ecosattvas in response to the kind of situation we find ourselves in. I mean, we're going to be doing that in different ways, of course, but I think the old idea that it's simply individual salvation that ultimately, I'll go to nirvana or heaven or whatever, and I hope you'll go too. But whether or not you do, it sort of doesn't make any difference to me, really. That my well-being is ultimately quite separate from your ultimate well-being. I mean, I think that we're sort of growing beyond that. Sorry, I'm ranting and raving a bit here, but
I hope so, and I'm right there with you. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about integration. That's one of the biggest challenges we face, because we do, even as just in our individual practice, that's so very difficult for us to manage. And bringing in that, you mentioned our burnout and activism, or in other endeavors as well, that we often get this idea that we need to adhere to. This is a good idea. Being nice to others. Great idea. Absolutely. Totally on board with that. But how? How do we get better at that? How do we practice that? What is it that can energize and refresh that interest in doing so that it is fulfilling and not worrying us down? And that's, I see the tremendous value in the practice. And I would see it as in a secular approach is very helpful for that, because it helps ground it in this interconnected world, this one we do know, and we are here. There may be stuff afterwards, there may not, don't know, can't comment on that. But I do know I'm here, and I do know our kids, our grandkids, everything that I love is here on this pale blue dot. And that's something we have the chance perhaps to help others awaken to that interconnectedness. And that's, to me, what I see as the tremendous value of that collaborative, complementary, supporting nature of the tradition's encounter with modernity.
For the bodhisattva, and I think this is especially relevant today, where if, you and I don't know what's going to happen to me after I die. I don't know what happens there, but I think from a bodhisattva perspective, it doesn't make any difference. It's like the task is to do the very best that one can not knowing if anything one does makes any difference whatsoever.
Right, without an agenda. I'm being nice because then X.
Well, I think we do need an agenda in terms of, we're trying to accomplish something. But first of all, there's going to be the frustration when we don't accomplish everything we want. But it's not a personal agenda. I mean, if karma and rebirth are sort of literally true, that'll take care of itself. If I do the best I can right here and now.
Right. Yeah. There's no difference between a very traditional practitioner sitting next to someone like me. We're doing the same thing. The practice is indistinguishable from one another.
I've been very impressed by something Nisargadatta. It's actually an Advaitin, not a Buddhist, but I think he shows something very clearly when he says, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life turns." Powerful, powerful. One of the many things I love about that quotation is that I think he shows the relationship that love isn't just a kind of a feeling or an emotion. Love is the way of being, living in the world that is implied by the realization that I'm not separate from it. And, so often we think of the Bodhisattva path as sort of, well, traditionally it's like the kind of sacrifice on the part of the awakened person who could sort of disappear into nibbana, whatever that is. He or she chooses to be reborn, stick around here, help the rest of us. I think that misses the point, because as we begin to, have little glimpses and awaken, it doesn't mean that our sort of self-centered habits automatically disappear. How do we transform the basic motivations, the basic idea? Well, the usual one, insofar as I feel separate, it's inevitably going to be, at least in part, what's in it for me? What can I get to sort of secure myself to get where I'm wanting to get to? The Bodhisattva spirit, of course, is learning in situations to ask the very different question, because I'm not separate, because I'm part of this situation as all of you and everyone else is, what can I do to make this situation better for all of us? That's how we work through those self-centered habits. It's like being a bodhisattva in the world is also my own personal practice, insofar that's how I integrate whatever I'm realizing on the cushion. It's how I become a different kind of person. So becoming a bodhisattva is as much about my own quote-unquote liberation as it is about making the world a better place, I think.
There is a co-arising of one's liberation with everything else.
Boy, isn't that a great way to put it? Thank you. That really is exactly it. I haven't used that phrase, but I'm going to start to now.
You were welcome to. Heard it here first, folks. I'm going to shift us a little bit back onto that enlightenment topic, because I just want to hear your thoughts on that and your insights as to how you handle that in the book, for example. And is that perhaps part of what we were just talking about with the bodhisattvas?
Well, it is, but that goes back to the beginning. I started saying how I think we have some problematical views about enlightenment. I think for a lot of Buddhists, it's sort of this big black box that sort of we project onto, and it symbolizes the end of all of our problems, right? The end of our suffering and so forth. So a lot of that discussion about is awakening in the larger sense, about transcending this world or simply fitting into it. It seems to me that it's really important that we understand enlightenment, as I said earlier, as about deconstructing the sense of self, as happens in meditation, and reconstructing, which especially involves transforming our motivations, because those are the aspects, those are the habitual patterns that most affect how we relate to other people and how we relate to the world. So that's what I would focus on. The other thing that I didn't maybe discuss enough in the book, but I've been thinking about it since then, is thinking further about the implications of all the scandals in the Zen world, especially the sexual scandals, the kind of sexual abuses, and what does that really mean? Maybe we've had too simple a sense of what awakening is all about. I was very impressed with an analogy that my own teacher, Yamada Cohen, used to talk about how it is that there can be different degrees or clarities of awakening that are, in a sense, qualitatively the same if it's a genuine awakening. But there is nonetheless quantitatively huge differences between what's sometimes called a tip of the tongue taste as opposed to a real daigotete, right? A real sort of deep transformation. And he had this wonderful metaphor or analogy. As I said, it's as if that we have been told by our teacher to polish a wall, which seems like a very strange idea, but we take out our washcloth or whatever, and he or she shows us how to polish it. And we don't really understand what we're doing until there's this moment when we realize, hey, it's not a wall. It's a pane of glass that's been so covered over with crud and mud and paint that we thought it was a wall. And that moment, that insight, sudden in most cases, that, hey, there's something in the other side, that is a little opening. But there's a danger there because it's also very easy. In fact, it's usually unavoidable that to some extent that little opening is going to be reappropriated by the ego. Oh, now I'm enlightened. Now I've, right? And if we stop practice, then if we don't really keep up, then it's going to get covered again, covered over with dust and mud. So it's really, really important to keep polishing away until the glass is completely clean. And the daigotete, the great satori, is when the glass shatters, when there's no longer anything between us and what's on the other side. I really love that analogy because it just makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if it helps us understand how it is that you can have, teachers who have some insight, but nonetheless, there's still a lot of mud on that glass. There's still a lot of problematic, self-centered tendencies that sort of get in the way with actually manifesting whatever it is that they might have realized. Some people talk about, maybe we shouldn't talk a lot about enlightenment as a state that some people achieve or are in, but maybe as activity. Maybe it's better to say that in certain ways, certain of our activities can be something like awakened or enlightened, but that doesn't imply that others might be still dualistic, still exploitative in certain ways.
Yeah, and I'm more inclined towards that kind of interpretation. And bear in mind, that's because that's what I resonate with in this, because it does prompt and encourage taking action. And it loosens that putting enlightenment on a pedestal as an attainment. Because when we have an attainment, then we're encouraging a striving for, instead of simply taking right action, right speech, right intention in this moment.
Well said.
Tell us a little bit here about, in your writing of the book, what stood out for you as one of the most important aspects of it while you were doing the writing?
Well, again, it was this theme, this kind of overriding theme that I mentioned a moment earlier of how it all seems to fit together with an understanding of the path. Is not about transcending this world, not about simply fitting into it in a narrow psychological sense, but rather it's all about deconstruction and reconstruction. And that this is consistent with, I think, a kind of growing biological realization about the universe as a constant sort of self-organizing phenomenon. And when we ask the question about ourselves and our society, we can see that same process occurring. I guess that's what I find exciting. And to be frank, it seems to me that we really need to move toward some understanding along this line.
So what are you hoping that the readers get out of the book, and what else would you like to share with the listeners? Big questions for the last.
That's a good question. Maybe I've already had a chance to touch on what I hope that they will be focusing on. I think the kind of critique that I started out with, criticizing the path and understanding of the path that somehow is transcending this world and inevitably, therefore, devaluing this world to some extent. If we see through that, then we're going to be avoiding a lot of problems, both individually and collectively. And likewise, if we understand that the path is about a lot more than just sort of clearing up what's going on in my own head, then I think that too has really important implications. Implications both for the Buddhist tradition and for how Buddhist practitioners individually and collectively engage with the really great social and ecological challenges that we face today. Sometimes I think about it in terms that, to this degree, I think the Buddhist tradition needs to wake up. I know that sounds a bit presumptuous, just as the title of the book is somewhat presumptuous, but I think that this is kind of a natural development that sort of fits in with what modernity is able to offer.
Our guest today, David Loy. You can find out more about his work on his website, davidloy.org. David, thank you so much for being here. Wonderful to speak with you as always.
My pleasure, Ted. Thank you for inviting me, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.